Psalm 23, and then you'll see the list that's on the board behind me. We're going to talk about Matthew chapter 2. We're going to look at some things in connection with that. Matthew chapter 9, Matthew 25, John 10, John 21, Hebrews 13, 1 Peter 2, Revelation 17, and maybe a few more things in connection with Jesus being presented to us as a shepherd. But Psalm 23 is the preeminent text in regard to that. It opens with the words, "The Lord is my shepherd." And I'm going to stop right there in the middle of that sentence, because at least in my Bible it's got a big semicolon there, which means that phrase is broken. What does that even mean, the Lord is my shepherd? Okay. Our leader, our protector. Any other thoughts? Provider. That's an excellent answer. Okay. If he is our shepherd, then we are his sheep, a part of his fold. What else do shepherds do besides provide and lead and all those other things? There's a great video I had that I was actually going to put up on there that I forgot to do of this silly sheep that is running along beside a ditch and falls into it, and then a guy comes along and digs it out, and it takes 3 bold leaps and lands right back in the ditch, and it is the life of most all of us. Jesus is the shepherd. We're the sheep that keep falling into the ditch, needing to get taken out. That's another role that the shepherd is. Savior. Say, what about the protection against the lions and the wolves and the predators that seek the sheep? Who provides the sheep protection? Do sheep protect themselves? They're extremely vulnerable. They have no real protections naturally, and they are easy prey. The shepherd is the one that protects them and guards them. And so there's a role as well in that. As this opens up, the Lord is my shepherd, the next phrase is, I shall not want. Does that mean that I don't have desires because the Lord is my shepherd? That's the way we use that word today, right? I want that. What does that mean, I shall not want, as it's used in this way? Right. Needs. Lacking. To want means that you lack something that you need. You are in want of food. You are in want of clothing. You are in want of shelter. You need these things. You don't have them. That is a want, as it's being used here. If God is our shepherd, specifically if the Lord is our shepherd, in the person of Christ, is there anything we have that lacks? Now, does that mean that we always have everything that we desire? No. Does that mean we even always have everything that we need? This is a loaded question. At any given moment, I'm sorry?
Define need.
Yeah, well, that's a good aspect of it as well. You have to define need, but there are obviously things that we do actually need. And by the way, there are priorities that you can set among needs as well. There are some needs that are greater than other needs. I have the need of food and water, and that's a much greater need than companionship. Both of them are needs, but one is a greater priority than the other. You don't worry about companionship until you've secured what? Food. That's if you're without food, that's the first thing you're concerned about. Now, after I've secured food, then I start worrying about these other things. So there are priorities with wants, and so we have to ask those kind of questions. Is this something that's really needed or not? And even if it is something that's needed, where does it fall on that spectrum of how badly it's needed? But also, this does not guarantee that I shall never be in want. It guarantees that I shall not want, which simply means that He has provided means to supply what we need. Among those things that He has supplied us, for instance, is instructions to be willing to do what? Be willing to labor with our hands so that we have our food. That's part of the way that He keeps us from being in want, is by telling us to be industrious and to work and to be willing to work. And sometimes that's not possible. And so what else has He done?
He's fulfilled our spiritual needs.
Okay, He's fulfilled our spiritual needs. But what if I have this physical need and I'm not able, I'm truly not able to work? What has He built in as well? He gave instructions. What am I supposed to do if I see someone who is in need? He's provided a means for others to show their piety by demonstrating love toward people who are in want. Remember, we're talking about doing unto others as you would have them do unto you. If you were starving and someone came along who had not only enough food to feed themselves, but enough food to feed themselves and extra, what would we want them to do? Well, can you give me some of that? Okay, if I know that, what if I'm the one who has the goods? I should be looking and ready to share what I have. So all that comes into play. He has provided places and ways for these needs to be met. He has also caused the sun to shine and the rain to fall, which makes certain that what happens? Food grows. Has He ever promised that we're going to get food without having to gather it? Even back when He supplied manna from heaven, what did we learn? You had to go out and get it. And how often did they have to go get it? Daily. If they tried to store up so that they didn't have to gather on the next day, what happened? It went bad. With the exception of one day a week, because they were commanded to honor the Sabbath, and so they weren't to collect on the Sabbath, and so the extra that they took up the day before the Sabbath actually stayed good for the second day. But He never ever, even when He was supplying literally free food, He never gave it to them without expecting them to gather. In John 2, when Jesus turned the water into wine, did He expect men to do anything? Or did He just make it happen? What was the first thing He said? Here was this need. They had run out of supplies to supply their wedding guests. And this need was brought to Him, and the first thing He said was what? Go get the water pots and fill them up. See, even when He was going to supply them with what they needed, He expected them to do what? To work for it. To act and do what they could. Now, were they able to supply their needs? No, but they were able to do what they were able to do. He expected them to do that. And then He made up the rest, if you will. He made the difference. And the difference was turning that water that they gathered into what they needed. And so we have to keep all that in mind. I shall not want doesn't mean I shall not work. I shall not want doesn't mean that I don't have to do anything, or I should just sit back and expect God to provide everything without me having to lift a finger. It means that when I've done everything that I'm supposed to do and I have something to show for it, fruit for my labor, what should I do? Come on, Shenandoah. Y'all heard this story? Y'all seen the movie Shenandoah? We got some visitors. They hadn't heard the story yet. Love the story. Jimmy Stewart movie, Shenandoah, is a great movie. At the very beginning of the movie, he brings all of his boys around the table and he offers a prayer for the food because his deceased wife always insisted that they offer thanks for their food. And so his prayer, and I'm going to paraphrase it because it's quite long, goes something along the lines of, We found the land, we cleared the land, we busted up the land, we got the rocks out of the land, we tilled the land, we planted it, we provided water for the plants, and we raised it, then we picked it, brought it in, cleaned it, and cooked it, but we think you're still the same anyway, Lord. And his prayer essentially was what? We did all this for ourselves, but we're going to offer you thanks. By the end of the movie, his attitude changes. He comes to realize that even when we do all those things, we still depend on how many people can make the plant produce food? How many people can make the seed grow? You ever tried to raise a garden? You can want seeds to sprout all you want to. It doesn't happen until somebody else makes them sprout. They don't grow until somebody else makes them grow. They don't set fruit until somebody else makes them set fruit. And then you got to get the fruit before the birds eat it. All my figs have gone to the birds this year, just about. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. That's just a word painting. In other words, He has led us to the place where we can eat. But does the shepherd consume the grass for the sheep? Does the shepherd go out into the field, pick the grass, carry it to the sheep, and put it in the sheep's mouth and chew it for him? No, what's He do? He just leads the sheep to the place where they get sustenance. And they still have to go out and graze. Now, all of this has multiple levels. There are spiritual aspects of this as well. Somebody mentioned a little earlier about the fact that He provides for us spiritually. It's the same thing. Listen, He gave us His Word. His Word contains everything pertaining to life and godliness. Everything that we really need to know in order to live this life the way that we were intended to live it and to be godly and have a relationship with Him. And yet there are people, though He has brought us to this pasture, who are unwilling to what? Feed on it. They won't feed on it. I love the imagery in other places in the Bible where it talks about the man who is so lazy that he has his hand in the plate and is unwilling to put the food to his mouth. That's the imagery of someone who is not willing to pursue the knowledge of God. He's led us to these pastures. All we have to do is eat. He leads me beside still waters. What's so significant about that? Okay, it's do we need food? Yes. Do we need water as well? By the way, on that list of priorities, where does it fall? It's extremely high. It's even higher than food. We can go a lot longer without food than we can without water. He restores my soul. Now, there's two things that are extremely important about that simple 4-word sentence. He restores my soul. This restoration takes place where? In my soul. What is a soul? That's a good question. I'm waiting for an answer. Okay. So and it gets difficult, by the way. I want you to understand, because there are places in the Scripture where the soul and spirit are treated as different things, and there are other places where the two words are used interchangeably, and there are other places where they're clearly being used to discuss the exact same thing in that context. And so I'm not sure we're supposed to be making that kind of distinction. We're talking about the inner man. We're not talking about the body. We're not talking about the physical existence. We're talking about our souls, the inner man, the part of us that shares something with God. The part of us that wills, the part of us that plans, the part of us that determines what our body's going to do. What happens if we simply follow our bodies? Nothing good. Yeah. Nothing good happens when we follow our bodies. That's not the order that God intended. That's not the order that He set it up. The idea that He has and reveals to us is that our spirits, our souls, our inner man should control what our body does rather than let our body control what we do. He restores our soul. How does He do that? Well, I would suggest to you part of the way He does that is through leading us to the green pastures, providing us the information that we need, providing us the guidance. How about this? Providing the example that we can follow in His steps. Being the shepherd. That's how He restores our soul, by being the shepherd and leading us to the things that we need, the pasture and the water. Miss Karen? Okay. And so look at the last half of verse 3, and this in large part is parallelism. It's actually explaining how He restores my soul. He leads me in the paths of righteousness for His name's sake. Again, when we first started off and I asked the question, what does it mean that the Lord is my shepherd? One of the things that was suggested was that it means He leads us. How does He lead us? He leads me in the paths of righteousness. Now, there's something significant even about that statement, because what it suggests is that if we don't follow Him, we can't get to righteousness. What would happen to sheep, or let me say it this way, what does happen to sheep without a shepherd? They scatter. And what happens to sheep that scatter? They get consumed. They die. They either die because they can't find water, they die because they can't find food, or they die because they fall prey to the wolves. Or worse, to men who make mutton chops out of them. They need a shepherd so that they stay a flock. And even Jesus uses that imagery to talk about His own disciples. And we're not talking about the bigger circle of disciples, the 120 that He had. We're talking about the 12, the guys who were with Him all the time. When they came and arrested Jesus, what happened to them? They scattered. What was the imagery He used to describe that to them? That they would be like sheep without a shepherd. That's what happens to sheep when they don't have someone leading them. It's what happens to man when we don't have someone leading us. There's a way that seems right to man, but its end is destruction, death. He leads me in the paths of righteousness. I can't rely upon myself and my determination about what is good or right. What that tells me is that rightness isn't subjective. But what does the world tell us right now? The world tells us that to suggest that rightness is objective is evil. And that everyone has their own truth. It's nice to hear them tell their truth. Look, truth is not subjective. Right is not subjective. If it is, if we deal with something from a subjective standpoint and call it right or call it true, we don't understand what truth and rightness really are. And we might occasionally be right. But the fact that we're right doesn't make it right. What makes it right is that God says is right. And sometimes, even people who are not following the shepherd choose to do right. And there's discussion about that in the Scriptures as well, right? When he talks about the Gentiles, who though they are without the law, keep the law. There are aspects of it that they honored. There's all kinds of things in the world, and I think it's safe to say that everybody's on the same page, that we acknowledge that there are fewer people who are seeking to follow Jesus and accept Him as their shepherd than there are people who are not following Him. And yet, our society universally condemns things like murder and theft and, to some lesser degree, abusing people. In fact, over the last year, most of the arrests in Lafayette Parish have been around domestic abuse. Because pretty much all of society says, you know what? You don't have the right to treat other people that way. And if you do that, you're going to be punished. It's not the fact that most people view it that way that makes that behavior wrong. What makes that behavior wrong is that God said you should love your neighbor as yourself. Because everyone was created in the likeness and image of God. And see, that goes all the way back to Genesis, right? We get all the way back to Genesis, and you remember the flood story, and then Noah gets off the ark, he builds the altar, he offers a sacrifice to God, God makes a covenant with him, and he tells him that he's going to give him the animals for food like he gave the green plant, and then he tells him, though you can shed these animals' blood, what's he say about man's blood? You can't just wantonly take the life of man. And in fact, it's such a serious offense with God. God said if you do that, if you just wantonly take the life of man, then man should do what? Take your life. That's the price you have to pay for that. Is you forfeit your own right to live on the earth if you take another life without cause. Why was the reason? Anybody remember what Genesis, 9? Anybody remember what Genesis 9 says? The reason for that? For in the image of God, He made man. See, the reason why I shouldn't abuse someone else is because they belong to God. And they're made in the image of God, and therefore they have certain inherent value according to God. So much so that even when someone mistreats me, what does God say that I should do in response? To not return in kind and to not seek vengeance. Let God seek vengeance. Why do we let God seek vengeance? Even my children don't belong to me. They belong to God. And so that's why we talked about this earlier. The way in which I function as a father is dictated not by my wants and wills and wishes, but by what? By God's desire for me. He leads me in the path of righteousness. The only way I can be a good husband, the only way I can be a good father, the only way I can be a good neighbor, the only way I can be a good employee, the only way I can be a good citizen is to listen to what God says about how to act in those relationships. That's the only way it's going to happen. He leads me in the paths of righteousness. Then the next phrase is very powerful. For His name's sake. You know what that means? Our behavior reflects on Him. The reason why He has taken the time to send forth His Word into the world and to tell us how to act and how to treat people and what to do is so that we don't bring reproach upon Him. He made us. We belong to Him. in a much less absolute way, our society has laws that reflect that same idea. Minor children, if they do something wrong, who is legally liable? Parents are. Why? Because they're responsible for the children. Okay, we understand that. And the reason I know we understand that is because we collectively have said, you know something? Because this is true, we need to codify this and make sure everybody follows this principle. That the parents are ultimately responsible for the children, so they need to be watching them. They need to make sure that they don't do things that are wrong. And if the kids do things that are wrong when the parents ought to be making sure that they don't, we're going to penalize the parents for failing. So what does that mean about my behavior and how it reflects upon God? Especially if I wear His name and claim to be a follower of the Christ. Think about that. Well, it's kind of scary when you do. He leads me in the paths of righteousness for His name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. We talked about the role of the shepherd as protector, right? Even though something looms over us so great that it's able to be called the shadow of death. Anytime you see the shadow of something, you see a shadow of a tree or a shadow of a person, what do you know? That there's a tree or person close at hand. So we're talking about things that are able to even threaten our very life. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Why?
Well, I think to me, a reference of that is sin. Shadow, death being in sin, you're separated from God. And don't be afraid you're in Christ. If you walk through that, that's all around you.
There is definitely that spiritual application to this. Perfect love casts out fear. How does perfect love cast out fear? If you love me, you'll keep my commandments. If I'm keeping the commandments of God, if I'm walking with Him, if I know I have a relationship with Him, I don't even fear death, do I? Why? Because death has no power over me. Because the sting of death is sin. And if I've been saved from sin, then death doesn't have a sting anymore. Listen to what he says. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Because I know the shepherd is there. Because I know he is watching. Because I know he's protecting. Because I know that the path he leads me on is safe. It doesn't matter what the world looks like around me if I'm walking in his footsteps. If I'm following the shepherd, I know I am on safe ground. That is, right there in one sentence, the entire message of the book of Revelation. That is picturing this great war where it looks like the evil one is winning and the situation is hopeless, but in fact, the victory's already been won. All I have to do is follow the Lord. Go ahead, Mr. John.
I was just thinking that this example
Now the next phrase, the next phrase makes this very, very hard, but it's still true. I will fear no evil, for you are with me. By the way, this is this is a semicolon. The sentence hasn't completely ended yet. There's a related clause left to be said. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Now, the staff part of it is easy enough. Listen, shepherds carry staffs for one major reason. What is it for? To protect and save the sheep. Anybody know why a shepherd's staff usually had a crook on the end of it? So you could pull them up when they've got themselves in a hole. So you have a way to grab a hold of them and pull them out. But the rod imagery involves a little bit more than just, oh, by the way, I guess I'll talk about the staff a little bit more from this perspective. What is the other thing that the shepherd does with his staff? Beat off the enemy. So it's protection. Protection and deliverance. But the imagery of the rod, what is that? Now, that's the other end of that staff. Because you know what the shepherd also does with that staff? If one of the sheep is kind of trailing off, you know what he does with it? He goads it. He pokes it and pushes it back where it needs to be. What is that? That's discipline's what it is.
Same thing as a child.
Yep. It's being told that I'm wrong. It's being told that I need to repent. It's being told that I need to change. It's being told that if I don't change, that there's a consequence coming. It's the exhortation part of the gospel. See, the good news of the gospel is all about Christ coming and His sacrifice and hope and grace and all of that great stuff, but it's also correction and exhortation and a call to repent. Rod and staff. Now, here's the question. I can understand how the staff part comforts me. It's nice to know that there is somebody close at hand who has a tool that he can use to rescue me from my own foolishness and to fend off those that are trying to destroy me. That's very comforting. Just like it was when I was in the schoolyard and the biggest, strongest guy on the playground was standing beside me and had my back and was my friend. I wasn't too worried about anybody else doing anything with me because the biggest guy on the playground was standing right beside me and was willing to go to war for me. That's a nice and comforting thing. What about the discipline side of it? Do we often take comfort in discipline? But we should. Is it personal? Are we corrected? Go ahead, Miss Peggy.
Proverbs 29:15,
The rod and rebuke. Oh, there's that nasty word, rebuke. Reprove and rebuke, those are the rough words. But they give wisdom. See, there is the kindness, but there's also the severity of God. And when you deal with God, you get the whole package.
But in Proverbs, it says, "Food despises correction."
Yep. And so we have to learn to receive the discipline of God in the same spirit that we receive His grace. We're grateful to learn what we're doing that's wrong. We're grateful to be corrected by His Word. We're grateful for those things and find comfort. We don't become defensive because we feel threatened by them. And by the way, this means that the shepherd has an important role because we can apply all of these things we're talking about here to any one of our various things in life where we are the shepherd of other people. Whether we're a boss, whether we're a parent, whether we're a shepherd of a home as a father or a husband, whether we're elders and overseers of the Lord's church, whether we're whatever scenario you might envision where someone is given charge over others, this is the blueprint of how it's done. You lead them to supply all of their needs. You don't lead them to serve your needs, you lead them to supply theirs. You bring them to the pastures, you bring them to the water, you restore their soul. You help them to see the path of righteousness for the sake of your shepherd. When he talks to shepherds in the New Testament, he tells them to understand that Christ is what? The chief shepherd. What's the whole point about that? Well, it's real simple. Yeah, okay, I might have charge here in this limited capacity, in this limited place, over these limited people, but I have a shepherd over me too. I'm to be following my shepherd. He's the chief shepherd. So I just mimic what he's done for me. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil. You're with me, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. There's a banquet that's laid out for the people of God, for the flock of God. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. That phrase right there, my cup overflows, the exact same thing as I'm doing better than I deserve. My cup overflows. I have even more. And by the way, that applies in any and every circumstance I'm in life. Paul makes that argument in Philippians, right? To learn to be content in whatever circumstances you find yourself in, even in times when you are in want, to be content, because ultimately what God has provided for you is greater than what you deserve. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. That is Jesus as a shepherd. If the Lord wills, we will continue with this line. And we need to pay very, very close attention. Everybody sitting in this room, every single one of us, at some place, at some time, and in some way, fills the role of shepherd for someone. This is important stuff. This is teaching me how to do this right. Thanks for your presence and for those that are online.